What's up, APUSH crew? Today we're going to break down period 6 in the APUSH curriculum. We're going from 1865 to 1898. If you want to get real super smart on these topics, click any one of these 4 videos and you'll get all the real nitty-gritty details. Today we're going to try to go quick. So one important topic is post-Civil War expansion. In the post-Civil War era, there's a lot of economic opportunities out in the West. These include mining, farming, and the cattle industry. And the government had actually established policies such as the Homestead Act. If you went west, you can get 160 acres of land. It's not necessarily the best land, but you can get this land for relatively cheap. The Pacific Railroad Act, which established the route for the Transcontinental Railroad. So the government is facilitating the movement of people west. In fact, the government is very active in this process because it is going to be the government, unfortunately, removing the native people, forcing them onto reservations, more on that in a moment, and giving land and grant subsidies to the railroad companies for this expansion to take place. So it's important you know the role of the government in this western expansion. As the nation is expanding west, there is a growing conservationist movement in the country. They're starting to realize that we need to preserve some of our natural resources, and there's really a battle between government agencies and conservationist groups versus corporate interests who want to make money off the water and the air and other things, and who's really going to control these natural resources. You do have the Department of the Interior. It was established in 1849, and its job, it was responsible for the management and conservation of federal land and other natural resources. The U.S. Fish Commission is established in 1871. It's created to preserve the fisheries of the U.S. so we don't overfish and run out. And really a huge person in the conservationist movement is John Muir. In 1892, he establishes the Sierra Club, and its whole purpose was to fight for conservation and preservation of natural resources. And we're really going to see in period 7, Theodore Roosevelt's going to be the guy who's going to make this happen on a federal level. Unfortunately, conservation is not going to be something the government's interested in when it comes to Native Americans. Their policy kind of can go into 2 categories during this time period: violent conflict or assimilation policies. There's a whole bunch of battles that take place. Really, they're massacres. The Sand Creek Massacre, the Colorado militia goes in, attacks, and kills over 100 Native people, many of them women and children. The Battle of Little Bighorn, 1876, the Sioux tribe, inspired by the leadership of Sitting Bull, kills Colonel Custer and his men in the 7th Cavalry. It's also known as Custer's Last Stand. However, the government's going to come in after the Battle of Little Bighorn and round up the Sioux resistance. There's a ghost dance movement which begins amongst the Sioux Indians in the Dakota Territory, where they feel like this is a kind of cultural revival. They're going to get rid of the white man. The buffaloes are going to return and all's going to be well. However, the U.S. government is going to come in with the Battle of Wounded Knee, which is the last major Indian battle in 1890, where the U.S. Army goes into the Dakotas and kills over 200 Native people. Once again, this is more of a massacre than it is a battle. Assimilation policies: tribes were oftentimes forced onto reservations such as the Great Sioux Reserve, and this was supported by laws such as the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. Its whole purpose was to end tribal ownership of land. The government wants Native tribes to dissolve, and they want to force them onto private farms. We also see various Native American schools opening up with the support of the federal government, and their goal, their duty, was to assimilate Native people. Kill the Indian, save the man was the idea in these schools. Another thing happening during this post-Civil War era is industrialization. You have large-scale production, tremendous technological change, all sorts of new inventions, making life easier, improved communication networks, and you see business during this time seeking to maximize the exploitation of a growing labor force and natural resources. Key to this, though, is industry leaders such as Carnegie, of course the steel guy, and Rockefeller Oil, who are seeking to dominate their respective industries through a variety of techniques. You got horizontal integration being used, where you control all competition in a particular industry. In other words, you're consolidating all your competitors to monopolize a market. Vertical integration, you control all aspects of production, of manufacturing, from extracting the raw materials to selling the finished product. And in order to eliminate or reduce competition, business leaders sought to establish monopolies, trust, and pools. They also believed and defended their wealth with ideas such as social Darwinism, meaning the rich are rich because they're hardworking and the poor are poor because they're lazy or inferior. And this idea of survival of the fittest. In fact, one of the other key aspects of this period is advocating for laissez-faire policies. In other words, the government should not regulate business. It's important you know about the regional differences. So you have the West experiencing its own economic growth and population growth. The North and the Midwest is industrializing, but you also have the South. And after Reconstruction, there was an attempt at industrializing the Southern economy. Some refer to it as the New South. And there is a growth in the number of textile industries in the South. Remember, the South was largely agriculture. So you have textile mills and factories coming into southern states. However, the South remained, even though you have this idea of the New South, the South remained primarily agriculture. In fact, tenant farming and sharecropping continued to be the predominant labor system of the Southern economy. And it's really African American laborers and poor whites, but really black laborers who are doing much of this work in the tenant farming and sharecropping. Now, during this time, during this Industrial Revolution, there's a lot of good happening. Industrialization and urbanization, people moving to the cities, largely because they're looking for jobs. They're bringing about new economic opportunities for immigrants and workers. People are going from rural areas to urban areas. Immigrants are coming from other countries looking for these new economic opportunities, and the workforce is expanding. We also see this time period presenting new career opportunities in spite of a lot of social prejudice for African Americans and women and other disadvantaged groups. Now, a real key point in period 6 is this: while industrialization brought numerous opportunities to workers and dramatically expanded the workforce, low wages and dangerous working conditions continued to be a problem. So yes, there were jobs, but life was very difficult for workers. And as a result of this, workers are going to fight back. They're going to fight back to try to change this reality. And you're going to see workers organize. You have the Knights of Labor you should know about in 1869, founded. Terence Powderly is one of the key figures in this union. They opened up the union to all workers, skilled and unskilled workers. This was unique. Women and African Americans were also allowed to join the union. However, after the Haymarket riot, where labor unions were kind of attached to radical movements, they are going to suffer a decline in numbers. The big one, though, is the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, founded in 1886. Make sure you know about Samuel Gompers. They're going to focus on skilled workers, and they're not really interested in social reforms. They focus on bread and butter issues, practical things like wages, working condition, and hours. And by 1900, it was the largest union in the country. Now, workers, if you're going to evaluate the labor movement during the Gilded Age, during this industrial era, they are going to have some successes and failures. Workers did form local and national unions that did directly confront growing corporate power. And you're going to get the beginning of a national labor movement and the rise of union leaders such as Eugene Debs. You're going to see him at the Pullman strike, and Mother Jones in the Knights of Labor. However, this is going to be followed by a lot of failures. Homestead strike in 1892, workers at Carnegie Steel are defeated during the strike. Henry Frick is going to call out the guards, and the union's going to be busted. Pullman strike in 1894, President Cleveland is going to use the army in a court injunction to defeat the strike. Eugene Debs will be thrown in jail. And a big problem for the unions was also division amongst themselves. You have division between skilled and unskilled workers, ethnic and racial groups. Very often, workers' unions were against immigrants like the Chinese in the West, so you're going to have problems organizing. You're also going to have hostility from corporations. They're going to be hiring Pinkerton guards, yellow dog contracts, pledging you won't form a union, and the government is going to be on the sidelines, offering no protection because of the laissez-faire policies of the time period. It's important you know that the lives of farmers was also changing as they had to adapt to mechanized agriculture. They had to buy all this new equipment, which made them more efficient in producing crops, and a dependence on powerful railroad companies. Farmers are going to have a lot of problems as they become more efficient at growing crops. As agriculture becomes more and more mechanized, prices are going to fall. You're also going to see unfair railroad business practices. Railroad companies will oftentimes charge small farmers more than large farmers. The high cost of machinery is going to cause huge amount of debt. Tight money supply, not having access to cheap money, is going to be a concern, and of course high tariff policies amongst many Republican administrations. All of these things are going to cause farmers to also organize. A couple of key farmers groups you should know about. The Grange movement is going to start off organizing social and educational activities, but later on they're going to lobby the state legislators in places such as Illinois for reforms. We're going to see how that works out in a moment. The Farmers Alliance will follow in the 1870s, really in Texas. They're going to be split though, because in the South you're going to have division. African American farmers are going to have to form their own farmers group called the Colored Farmers Alliance, and they're going to ignore the plight and the problems of tenant farmers. And the big one you should know about is the one that actually forms into a political party, the Populist Party. They're going to be key. Their strength is going to be amongst farmers, but also amongst workers, and their platform is pretty varied in what they want. And they're really calling for political reform and a stronger role of the government in the economy. For instance, they want the government to own the railroad companies. 2, they want the free and unlimited coinage of silver to increase the money supply so that farmers have access to cheap money. 3, they want to have an income tax, which the rich would pay more. 4, they want to have political reform where people would have the direct election of senators. This was not the case at this time. And 5, they also want reforms such as the initiative and referendums so that you could take away power from these powerful business interests and these political machines. Which leads us to the government and the role of the government. Mark Twain famously called this era the Gilded Age, and what he meant was below the surface things are not as good as they seem. There was rampant corruption and problems in this time period. Politics during the Gilded Age was tied heavily to big business, and remember there's a laissez-faire philosophy which prevented the government from actively regulating the economy. But it's important you understand that you're going to see the start of government regulation during this period. During the Grange movement, they got laws passed, Granger laws, which protected farmers against abuse of the railroad industry. In the case Munn versus Illinois, the court ruled that states could in fact regulate the railroads. However, that's overturned in the Wabash case in 1886, where the court rules the states cannot regulate interstate commerce, trade between different states. And that's going to eventually lead to the passage of the Interstate Commerce Act, which is going to regulate, the federal government is going to regulate trade between different states. In the beginning, it's going to be ineffective, but it's going to be an important precedent. The other big one you should know about is the Sherman Antitrust Act. This is going to outlaw trust and other monopolies that fix prices and restrained trade. And unfortunately for labor unions, it's going to be used against them in the beginning, not against the monopolies. That will change, however, with the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt during the Progressive Movement in period 7. Another important thing that's happening during this time period is the movement of people. And we're talking about large-scale internal within the United States, and external migration is taking place. We already saw the internal settlers seeking opportunities on the frontier out in the West. And remember, these opportunities are available as a result of the Homestead Act and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. They are going west. You're going to see the mass movement of people to urban areas as they're looking for jobs and hoping to get economic opportunities. African Americans are going to really begin to move out of the South slowly at first around the 1890s, but it's going to increase, especially during World War I and World War II, leaving Jim Crow laws, segregation, and heading to northern cities. This will eventually be called the Great Migration. And you're going to have external migration of people taking place. Large-scale immigration from China during this period. This will slow down dramatically with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Make sure you know about that. And after 1880, you're going to have a different kind of immigrant coming in from Europe, the so-called new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. And we're talking places like Russia, Italy, Poland, where my peeps are from, and others. They are largely going to settle in urban areas looking for job opportunities that are presented as a result of the Industrial Revolution. There is going to be a response to this changing immigration, and that is going to be the rise of nativism. In fact, during this time period, there's going to be various attempts to exclude and keep out immigrants. We've already heard about the Chinese Exclusion Act, effectively shutting out Chinese immigration to the United States. The American Protective Association was an anti-Catholic group made up of American Protestants that wanted to get restrictions and limits on the number of Catholics coming in. And you have various proposals for literacy tests, which was proposed to keep Southern and Eastern immigrants out of the U.S. And the idea here is that these immigrants are undesirable. They're going to undermine and ruin the American way. There are going to be various challenges of urbanization and immigration. Cities were often divided among classes between the rich and the poor, races, ethnicities, ethnic groups. For example, the Italians in Little Italy, the Chinese in San Francisco are going to form their own communities and cultures. Low wages and dangerous working conditions kept many workers in extreme poverty. Since you have so many workers confined in these cities, unskilled work leads to low wages. There's going to be a contrast during this time between the poor and the wealthy are enjoying lives of conspicuous consumption. They're able to spend huge amounts of money to show off publicly their economic power and status. That's not the reality for the majority of people living in the cities. In fact, many people in cities like New York are going to be living in tenement housing. It was extremely common, and Jacob Riis is going to document this in his famous piece, How the Other Half Lives, in 1890, giving a reality check to many Americans. Child labor is becoming increasingly common during this time, and immigrants attempted to both assimilate, for example, learn English, adopt to mainstream American culture, while also maintaining their own unique cultural identities. And political machines dominated city life by exchanging welfare services, food and other things, and jobs for political support. And this creates all sorts of corruption and fraud and waste. However, these challenges are going to begin to be addressed during the Gilded Age. You have the gospel of wealth, which was a belief that the wealthy had a moral obligation to help out those less fortunate. Andrew Carnegie talked about this in his piece, Wealth. Settlement house movement sought to relieve urban poverty and provide assistance to immigrants. And you see this with Jane Addams' Hull House in Chicago, helping immigrants transition to life in America. The social gospel movement challenged the dominant corporate ethic of the time, and this was a group of Christians which said Christians had a responsibility to deal with urban poverty and to help alleviate it. The Socialist Party and other organizations actually challenged capitalism itself, called it exploitive, and critiqued it. You had Edward Bellamy in his Looking Backward. A utopian socialist society is depicted in this novel, and in this society they have fixed the social and economic injustices of the time. In fact, the Socialist Party is going to run candidates for political offices at both the state and national level. And eventually, and this is in period 7, the effort to reform these problems will eventually lead to a movement known as the Progressive Movement in the 1890s. And we got some videos on that as well. Check them out. Finally, not only are there going to be people addressing the economic problems of the Gilded Age, you're going to have people addressing the social ones as well. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, NASA, sought to secure the right to vote for women, the right of suffrage. You have people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Carrie Chapman Catt working tirelessly throughout this time period trying to get the right to vote. Various African American leaders sought to advance the cause of civil rights. Important one for period 6 is Booker T. Washington, and he advocated African Americans should acquire vocational skills, job skills, to gain self-respect and economic security. He established the Tuskegee Institute to try to accomplish this goal, and Ida Wells Barnett was very active in not only the women's rights movement, but also in the campaign against lynching. That's a real quick rundown review. This is not meant to teach you everything in APUSH Period 6, but it's a reminder. If you want some more details, you want all the little details that's going to help you get that 5, click on any one of those 4 videos. If you haven't already done so, make sure you click that button and subscribe. Tell all your friends to do the same. Let them know how you're getting all those A's in your APUSH class. If you have any questions, post them in the comments, and if the video helped you out, click like. Have a great day. Peace. So it's important you know the role of the government in this Western expansion. As the nation is expanding west, there is a growing conservationist movement in the country. They're starting to realize that we need to preserve some of our natural resources. And there's really a battle between government agencies and conservationist groups versus corporate interests who want to make money off the water and the air and other things, and who's really going to control these natural resources. You do have the Department of the Interior. It was established in 1849, and its job, it was responsible for the management and conservation of What's up, APUSH crew? Today we're going to break down Period 6 in the APUSH curriculum. We're going from 1865 to 1898. If you want to get real super smart on these topics, click any one of these 4 videos and you'll get all the real nitty-gritty details. Today we're going to try to go quick. So one important topic is post-Civil War expansion. In the post-Civil War era, there's a lot of economic opportunities out in the West. These include mining, into 2 categories during this time period: violent conflict or assimilation policies. There's a whole bunch of battles that take place. Really, they're massacres. The Sand Creek Massacre, the Colorado militia goes in, attacks, and kills over 100 Native people, many of them women and children. The Battle of Little Bighorn, 1876, the Sioux tribe, inspired by the leadership of Sitting Bull, kills Colonel Custer and his men in the 7th Cavalry. It's also known as Custer's Last Stand. However, the government's going to come in after the Battle of Little Bighorn and round up the Sioux resistance. There's a ghost dance movement which begins amongst the Sioux Indians in the farming and the cattle industry. And the government had actually established policies such as the Homestead Act. If you went west, you can get 160 acres of land. It's not necessarily the best land, but you can get this land for relatively cheap. The Pacific Railroad Act, which established the route for the Transcontinental Railroad. So the government is facilitating the movement of people west. In fact, the government is very active in this process because it is going to be the government, unfortunately, removing the native people, forcing them onto reservations, more on that in a moment, and giving land and grant subsidies to the railroad companies for this expansion to take federal land and other natural resources. The U.S. Fish Commission is established in 1871. It's created to preserve the fisheries of the U.S. so we don't overfish and run out. And really a huge person in the conservationist movement is John Muir. In 1892, he establishes the Sierra Club, and its whole purpose was to fight for conservation and preservation of natural resources. And we're really going to see in Period 7, Theodore Roosevelt's going to be the guy who's going to make this happen on a federal level. Unfortunately, conservation is not going to be something the government's interested in when it comes to Native Americans. Their policy kind of can go